All right, welcome to our crash course lecture on joint movements and muscles. Now this lecture is intended for non-biology majors, people that are taking Biology 100 or other intro biology courses. It's not appropriate for people that are taking human anatomy and physiology, although it might be a good study tutorial. Okay, let's get started and talk about joints first. So a joint is a movable part in the body. It's an area where two or more bones connect, and it is an area where we potentially have some movement. In reality, we have lots of joints in the body that don't move at all, and these are called synarthroses. But today we're going to talk about diarthrotic joints, and diarthrotic joints are joints that are freely movable, and examples here are the synovial joints. So synovial joints are joints that are covered or encapsulated by a special synovial membrane. They're fluid filled, and they tend to be very, very flexible. And so examples of synovial joints are your knee joint, your hip joint, your elbow, your finger joints. All of these joints that you think of as joints are probably going to be synovial joints. Okay, before we get in to talk about what the joints are like, let's talk about some joint movements. And the first of these are flexion and extension. Flexion and extension are angular movements. That is, they change the angles between adjacent bones. So let's start with the picture right here, and that is flexion and extension. So if we start with the arm totally extended, it's called extension because the angle between these two bones is about 180 degrees. Now, if I flex those two bones, or three bones, that's going to reduce the angle to about 90 or 45 degrees. So this is flexion, that is extension. Flexion, extension. And we can do the same thing with our knee. I'm not going to do it for you, but you can see this guy is flexing and extending his knee. Now, as we're flexing and extending, you should be practicing this at home, and as you do that, I want you to figure out where the muscle is that does these joint movements, because chances are it's two different muscles. So the muscle that flexes, probably right here. The muscle that extends, you can feel, is back here. So what are the names of those muscles? All right, we can also flex and extend our spine or cervical spine. So flexion would be to go downwards like that. Extension is in our standard anatomical position. And then hyperextension would be to look way up. So again, think about where are those muscles that flex versus where are the ones that help me to extend. They tend to be on opposite sides of the joint. Okay, we can even flex and extend our hip joint and our shoulder joint as well. So you can see what's going on in our hip there. We're normally extended, that standard anatomical position. Up here we are flexed, and then back here we're hyperextended. Now let's take a look at the next picture. We're flexing and extending the shoulder. So shoulder flexion throws everybody off. They're trying to think about what does that look like. Well, it's zombies. Zombies are coming to get you, and what do those zombies look like? Zombies have shoulders that are flexed like this. So that is flexion, that is extension, and that is hyperextension. So as you do that and hyperextend, you should feel some tightness back here, so it should help you to localize or at least determine where those muscles are that do the hyperextension. Okay, flexion, figure out where those muscles are. Probably up here and right here, and we'll talk about those muscle names in just a little bit. Okay, now let's talk about flexion and extension of the carpus. The carpus is another name for the wrist. So this is your carpus. It's made of lots and lots of tiny little bones, and tiny little bones, if you remember the previous lectures, allow us to have great flexibility, but not great strength. So flexion like this, come on, come on. Extension like that, go away, and then hyperextension. Hyperextension, extension, flexion. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flex your arms like that. Where does it feel tight? Where are those flexor muscles? Right here. These muscles are actually called the flexor digitorum. Okay, now let's talk about abduction and adduction. And these are probably my two favorite joint movements. So abduction is to take an appendage away from the midline of the body. So abduction like this, okay, adduction like this. Okay, what do you do if you kidnapped a baby? Well, you abduct it. So abduction to take away, and ADD, adduction, to add back to the body. So we can abduct and adduct our shoulders. We can do it for our hips as well. And you can even do it for your hands. Abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, etc. Okay, and some joints, that is, our joints that are ball and socket joints, we usually can do some kind of circumduction. And this kind of gets like the hokey pokey. So if we can turn ourselves around like that, that is circumduction. And it involves both the muscles of abduction, adduction, flexion, and extension. So it's a very complex joint movement. Okay, and then some joints can rotate. Think about the joints that can rotate. You can rotate your head like that. Okay, so that is rotation, and that's when a bone spins around on its axis. And then we have eversion and inversion, which you can see up here on the screen. My feet aren't nimble enough to demonstrate this on screen right now, but you can turn your feet to the inside or towards the outside. Now, you can also point your toes up, like we see right here, and that's called dorsiflexion. So we're pointing up towards the dorsal surface, or you can point them down towards the ground, and we call that plantar flexion. So remember, where do you plant your crops? Well, you plant them in the ground. So plantar flexion is to stand on tippy toe and point those toes at the ground. All right, and then we have a really cool movement that is unique to humans and also to higher bipedal organisms, and that is the ability to supinate and pronate. And so supination is when you turn your palm outwards, and pronation is when you turn your palm downwards. So supination, give me a bowl of soup. This is how I would carry that soup. Pronation, I've got my palm downwards like I'm dribbling, like I'm a professional basketball player. All right, so we're going to talk about a few different joints in the body, and these joints can be classified as either planar joints, hinge joints, pivot joints, condyle joints, saddle joints. Again, I'm not going to go quite very far into the anatomy because this is an introductory class, but do realize that the anatomy of the joint sort of determines how mobile and how strong that joint is. Okay, let's start out first with the neck joint. Now, the neck joint, fellow anatomists, I realize there's 3 joints in there, at least 2. And so we're going to talk about this as one joint for this intro biology class. And so the 2 joints that are involved are a condyle joint and a pivot joint. The pivot joint lets us turn our head left to right, and then the condylar joint lets the other movements happen as well. So movements possible, we can do flexion, extension, lateral flexion, rotation. So these are 4 different movements here. So let's talk about the muscles that do this. So the muscle that's responsible for most of these movements is right here. It's called the Sternocleidomastoid. So that muscle has 3 names, and these 3 names basically apply to the bones that it attaches to. The sternum, which is the breastbone, the clavicle, which are the shoulder right here, and then the mastoid process, which is on the back of the temporal bone and occipital bone. So that's our sternocleidomastoid, and we have 2 of these muscles. It's a paired muscle, and this is really important because we have the ability to contract both of them at once, in which case, what do we have? We have flexion of the neck. On the other hand, I can just flex one, I can get some lateral flexion, or I can get a little bit of rotation, turning like that. Okay, now let's look at the muscles that extend the neck. Where is that? So when you flex, you can feel that these muscles are getting shorter. When you extend, it's these muscles back here that are doing the extension. So flexion, extension, these are our extender muscles. The muscles here are splenius and also our trapezius. So these muscles are forcefully shortening and allowing us to extend our neck and then even hyperextend if we like. Okay, let's talk about our shoulder joints. The next big joint down here is our shoulder. The shoulder is a ball and socket joint, and let me grab our skeleton and show you what that means. Come on, skeleton. Okay, here is Stan the skeleton, ready to show us where our ball and socket joints are. Here they are, ball and socket, and the ball here is the head of the humerus, and the socket here is the glenoid fossa made up by the scapula. So this one is a very shallow ball and socket that allows a very wide range of motion. In comparison, the hip is also ball and socket, but we usually can't move our hip nearly as much as we can move our shoulders. Maybe Stan can. Stan's very good and very nimble, but most of us probably can't pull our hip up or our leg up above 90 degrees. Okay, so that is a ball and socket joint. Now let's talk about the movements that are possible with a ball and socket. Well, firstly, we have flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and then circumduction. So this is a multi-axial joint, allowing it to move in several different planes. And it's only because we have that ball and socket anatomy that all of these movements are possible. Okay, so let's look at one of the first movements here, and this was zombie. And so zombie is when you have the arms or the shoulders flexed. This is shoulder flexion. So I want you to do that while you're watching this video and feel, where does it feel tight in here? You're probably pointing up here, and you're right, some deltoids are involved as well, but the primary muscle, one of the primary muscles is up here is the pectoralis major that helps you to lift your arms up zombie style. So that is our muscle of flexion of the shoulders. Okay, now let's talk about extension. Extension is when they go from a flexed position down. So karate chop is extension. So the muscle of extension is here is the latissimus dorsi, and this is a muscle that goes all the way on your back. and it basically originates up here on the lumbar region, on the thoracolumbar fascia, and it inserts up into the proximal part of the humerus on both sides, and allows us to do this really strong karate chop movement. So I call this the whack-a-mole muscle. It's a very, very strong muscle and very good at laterally basically placing down the arms or arm extension. Now let's go back up to our deltoid. Our deltoid already helped us out with the arm flexion, but it also helps us to achieve another movement, and that movement was abduction. Abduction of the shoulders here. So remember, abduction is this way, adduction is that way. So go ahead and stand there, abduct your shoulders. Where does it feel tight? Feels tight right here. So the deltoid muscle is the primary muscle of abduction. Okay, this is the muscle that helps us to pull our arms away from the body. Okay, and this slide here is just to remind me about circumduction. Circumduction is the ability to take your shoulder and do that. Move your arm around that way. Now, this involves lots of different muscles. It involves your pectoralis major. It involves your deltoid. It involves your latissimus dorsi and other muscles as well. So we're not going to learn all the individual muscles that help to participate in circumduction, but you should know that it is most of them that attach to the shoulder and the arm. All right, now let's go on to talk about a less complex joint, and this is the elbow joint. The elbow joint is a very simple hinge joint and is a joint with limited mobility. It allows two different movements, flexion and extension. So let's look at those movements. First of all, extension was like this, and then flexion was like this. So as you extend your arm, where do you feel it? Probably feel it back here, and as you flex your arm, you can feel the tightness up here. So this is the muscle of flexion, this is the muscle of extension. Let's look at those muscles. So flexion muscle here is our biceps brachii. You probably just call it the biceps, but if you're in a science class, anatomy class, human biology, if you just call it biceps, you're going to get it wrong, because biceps here refers to the fact that it has two heads. And as it turns out, we have a biceps in the leg as well. So if you just say biceps, you're going to get it wrong. So this is the biceps brachii, brachii here meaning arm. And that's the one that helps us to lift weights like this. Oh, feeling the burn. Okay, the opposite of the biceps is the triceps. Triceps here means it has three different heads, and this is a muscle that originates up on the scapula, also on the humerus, and that inserts on that olecranon process of our ulna, and it allows for this forceful extension of the elbow joint, or the forearm. So it allows us to extend the forearm, and that is the triceps brachii muscle. Okay, now let's go to another ball and socket joint, and this ball and socket joint is the hip joint. The hip joint is another ball and socket, like the shoulder, but it's not going to be as flexible. Now think about the reasons why. It's still a ball and socket, but what you can see here is that socket is a lot deeper, and it also has a lot stronger muscles attached to it, a lot bigger ball in there, a lot deeper socket. And this is because the ball and socket joint in the hip is sustaining and carrying around a tremendous amount of weight, 150, 200 pounds. Think about people that are 300 and even 400 pounds. This is a very, very strong joint, but it also means that it's not quite as mobile. We have very strong muscles and tendons on it, and so we don't generally have the same amount of mobility in the hip that we do in the shoulder. Okay, so the movements present here, I'll point back again, are flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and circumduction. It has the same movements as the shoulder, but we don't have quite the range of motion in those movements. All right, let's talk about flexion first. And when you're flexing your hip, you're basically pulling your thigh closer to your body. And so the angle here is about 90 degrees, and when I put it down, it's 180 degrees. Now, normally when you flex the thigh or flex the hip, your knee automatically flexes as well, and we'll talk about why that is in just a minute. It's very hard to pull your leg up or to flex the thigh without also flexing the knee because of the muscles that are involved. Now, the primary muscle of flexion of the hip is a muscle called the iliopsoas. And the iliopsoas is a complex of two muscles called the iliacus and the psoas major. And these are very, very deep muscles. Let me get our model out and I'll show you where they are on the body. Okay, so this is Muscle Man Stan, and he's going to show us where the iliopsoas complex is. So we've removed all his internal organs here, and you can see the urinary bladder here, the penis there, and then we have the hip bones right here, the iliac crest, and then attached to the iliac crest we have a muscle called the iliacus, and that's this muscle right here. So this is the iliacus, and then to the side of that is this muscle right here, which is our psoas major. So the psoas major and the iliacus together make up the iliopsoas, and this muscle is the primary muscle responsible for flexing the hip or flexing the thigh. Very, very strong muscle, and it's also a very tasty muscle. If you ever go to a steakhouse, order one of these, but don't call it the psoas major. Call it a filet mignon or a beef tenderloin, because that's what they call it there. But very, very tender, very tasty muscle, and also very strong. Okay, now we're going to talk about the muscles that help to extend the thigh or extend the hip. So remember, flexion was when the thigh was up like that, extension is when it's back down, and so the extender muscles and hyperextender muscles are principally going to be our gluteal muscles. So the gluteus maximus is the big butt muscle. So let's bring Stan back up here again. And Stan, show us your glutes. Okay, so gluteus maximus right there, that's helping to extend the hip and hyperextend the hip. So if he were to put his thigh out that way or his leg out that way, that would be hyperextension. Now on the inside here, which we can't see, if we pull this apart, we would be able to see the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. These are the muscles that help to abduct the thigh, to help to pull it out sideways. So those are abductor muscles, and if you go out like that, you can feel it in the side of your butt. So those are your abductor muscles. They help you to pull your leg away from your body. Now, let's think about where the adductor muscles are. What does hip adduction look like? So if hip abduction was taking your leg away, adduction is going back together again. So the adductor muscles, ADD, are located on the opposite side of your leg. So they're located on the inside of the leg right here. Okay, so if we look right here, the muscles on the inside, these are our adductor muscles. Let's take a look on the screen there. So we have different adductor muscles. We have the gracilis, we have the adductor magnus, the adductor brevis, adductor longus. All of them are located on the inside of the leg, and they help to adduct the thigh or adduct the hips and bring them back together again. Now, if you've ever been at a gym and you've gone on one of these torture machines, you might think, oh, it's very, very easy. And I remember the first time I got a gym membership, I sat down and did like 200 or 300 different reps, and after a while I was like, that's not so bad. But boy, howdy, you woke up the next morning and could barely move because you'd really overexerted those adductor muscles. All right, now let's go talk about the knee joint. Now, for all intents and purposes, we're going to call the knee joint a simple hinge joint. It's actually not that simple. There's a lot of going on in the anatomy, but the two movements that it really allows is flexion and extension. There's a little bit of rotation, but not enough to count. So we'll just call it flexion and extension. So when we can flex the knee is when the knee is flexed, and extended is when it is extended. Now, you can't see my knees here, but this person has their knee flexed. You can see that it's not 180 degrees between the thigh and the lower leg. And so our knee flexor muscles are located back here in the hamstrings. The hamstrings are in the back of your leg or back of your thigh, and they include muscles like the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. These are collectively called your hamstrings, and they help to flex the knee. Now, where are the knee extensors? The knee extensors are on the opposite side of the leg. So let's bring Stan back in here again. Fuzzy, fuzzy, fuzzy. Okay, so this is the front of the leg, the knee's down here. This is the quadriceps muscles right here, and especially this is the rectus femoris. Rectus here means straight, and the rectus femoris basically goes from the hip over here all the way down to the patellar tendon, patellar ligament, and then attaches to the tibia, and it allows us to extend our knee and make our knee go out straight. So that is a very, very powerful extensor muscle. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the ankle joint. Now, the ankle technically has several different joints, but the joint that we're interested here is the joint that allows us to do dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So dorsiflexion is the ability to put our toes up in the air like that. You can see this person is dorsiflecting their toes. And if you've ever been in the army or a marching band or anywhere we had to march, you know that it's very important that your toes point up and that you roll your feet, otherwise you get in trouble. So dorsiflexion involves this muscle right here, which is called the tibialis anterior. The tibialis anterior is located, as the name implies, on the anterior surface of the tibia and allows the toes to point upwards. Okay, so that is dorsiflexion. Now, the opposite motion here is called plantar flexion. This is when you point your toes down and you stand up tippy-toe like a ballerina. So plantar flexion is pointing your toes in the direction of the dirt where you would plant your crops. So that's how I remember plantar flexion. And the primary muscle involved in plantar flexion is going to be here, our gastrocnemius and also our soleus. So these muscles are basically attached to our calcaneal tuberosity over here, so our heel bone, and they go all the way up to our, let's see, femoral condyles. And they're a very powerful muscle and very efficient joint that allows it to lift a lot of weight. So plantar flexion is, again, pointing your toes to the ground and doing that tippy toe or toe raises. Chances are you can probably lift at least 1.5 to 2 times your weight easily, even if you don't work out, because it's a very efficient joint and a very, very strong muscle. Okay, so that's all our joints. To wrap up, we're going to demonstrate some joint movements, and you're going to try to tell me what muscles are involved. So sit there by your screen, and I'm going to call out Simon Says. Okay, so Simon says to flex the shoulders. What does that look like? So shoulder flexion is zombie. So zombie out there, we've got our shoulders flexed like this. Okay, what are the muscles of shoulder flexion? Up here, they're the deltoid muscle and also the pectoralis major. All right, Simon says to abduct the shoulders. So abduction of the shoulders looks like what? That's right, abduction to take away, we've taken them out from the sides. So where are those muscles again? Those muscles are right here on the top, and those again are our deltoids. Now, if Simon said to adductor shoulders, we're going back down, we're going like that, like we're doing a jumping jack. So where do you feel that burn? You probably feel it in here, because a little bit of that is your latissimus dorsi, but also your pectoralis muscles are helping you to adduct your arms there. All right, let's say Simon says to flex your cervical spine. What would that look like? Okay, flexion is this way. What muscle was involved? This muscle here. So turn, and you can see that muscle. It's called the sternocleidomastoid. Originates in the sternum, the clavicle, inserts the mastoid process, allows us to turn. Now, what muscle did the opposite? Back here, it was the splenius. So splenius helps us to look up. All right, Simon says to flex the hip. Flexion to the hip, going like that as much as I can. My thigh is pointing out. Now my knee is flexed too, but I'm not concerned about that. So what muscle is involved in hip flexion? Again, it's that filet mignon muscle that's inside my body, and that's called the Psoas Major or Iliacus. Okay, what is the muscle that helps me to extend my hip? The hip extension muscle, well, there's a few of them, but the one I want you to know is I want you to know about the Gluteus Maximus. Okay, very powerful hip extensor, also helps us to hyperextend the hip. Now, what about abduction of the hip? What would that look like? Again, abduction out to the side with the hip. Where do you feel that? Right here on the side butt. Gluteus Medius, Gluteus Minimus. All right, now let's say Simon says, dorsiflect your feet. Now, dorsiflexion, you can't see my feet right now, but my toes would be pointing up like that. If my toes are pointing up, what muscle is doing that? It's the tibialis anterior, which was on the previous slide. And of course, Simon says to plantar flex your feet, to go down like that. You're standing tippy toe, and again, it's your gastrocnemius and your soleus muscles. So you should be able to go through all these different movements that we've talked about this far and rattle off what the movement is, what muscles are involved, and what joints are involved as well. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this crash course and overview of some joint movements and major muscles of the body. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email or drop me a text. Talk to you later.